everyone. Welcome to General Assembly. My name is Dana, and I'm joined here today by Kathryn Minshew. Welcome, Kathryn.
It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited for this particular lesson. I know it's going to resonate with our audience. Just a quick couple of housekeeping tips before we get started on public speaking. If you guys have any questions for Kathryn at all, please do write them in the chat box on the right side of your screen. And also tweet at us. Tweet at Daily Muse and at GA, and we'll answer your questions live on the air after we get started talking about public speaking.
Yeah.
And you are the CEO of the Muse.
Mm-hmm.
You were previously a management consultant, so you have a ton of experience speaking in front of large groups and giving presentations. So why don't you talk a little bit more about why this subject matter is so important to you, and we'll launch right into it.
Perfect. Well, I'm really excited to be here. I think this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart because as much as I spend a lot of my day-to-day doing public speaking, talking to audiences, going on national television sometimes to talk about the Muse, it's still something that makes me nervous. I was nervous today before I came in here, and I think it's something that is a big holdup for a lot of people, especially when they think about moving forward in their careers and being in situations where they need to stand in front of a boardroom or an auditorium and talk about something that they're passionate about. And so one of the things for me that I really wanted to dig into today, one of the basics of public speaking was this idea of reframing it as storytelling. So why is that important? Well, I think stories are very core to the human experience. And so I think when you reframe public speaking, especially part of your talk as a story, it gives you a couple of big edges. It's easier to remember. Obviously, your stories are very personal to you. You know what happened. It often puts you at ease to tell a story, and it creates a bond, I think, with the person who's listening to you. Stories are also easier to remember. So you've got an edge there in terms of really getting kind of face-to-face in front of somebody, whether it's one-on-one or in a much larger group, and helping them really buy into the story of you and who you are and what you're trying to do. So before we go too far down the path of talking about really great stories, first I wanted to show an example of some very weak storytelling. So we have kind of a classic what not to do.
I've been using Google my entire life. I use it to find an academic program when I wanted to study abroad. I've searched for jobs using Google. I use Google to find restaurants. I use Google to translate phrases into English. I use Google to track flights. I use Google to define words I don't know. I use Google to search for instructions.
It's like hilariously funny.
Perfect.
That's actually one of our producers who was
I was going to say, so you're going to see a couple of more examples from the two of us and from some of our producers in here, but you kind of get an idea of what it's talking about. So with that in mind, this idea of kind of a classic public speech, I want you to then think about the last time someone told you a really good story, how their face lit up, how they got really excited, and I want to dig into what are some of the examples of great storytelling and how do you craft stories. So the first one, and one of the most important, is to tailor your message to your audience. Now this is particularly important when you're talking to groups large and small. I like to ask myself ahead of time, who are the people that I'm talking to? What age are they? What are their life experiences like? And then what are their goals and motivations? This is otherwise known as why are they here? Are they here because it's a conference? Is it a regular meeting and I'm presenting a new idea? Are they standing in the corner of a networking area, making eye contact with me and excited to learn more about my business? Or are they sort of looking around the room, checking their watch, looking at their phone? All of these are cues to their goals and motivations. And for me, they help me kind of tailor what I'm talking about, how long the story is, and what are the details that I include. One of the things that plays into this is this idea of relevant experience. So for me, I spend a lot of time talking about the origin story of the Muse. How did I start the company? Why did we kind of create this in the world, and why do we think it's important? And the way I tell that story is really different based on the audience and the demographic that I'm talking to. So for example, if I'm talking to a lot of really young people who probably have been in the job search sometime in the last 12, 24, 36 months, I can go very much with my personal story. I was a management consultant at McKinsey. I knew that I didn't want to be a management consultant forever, but I had no idea what I did want to do. And so I spent all of these nights and weekends and lunch hours looking at job listings. And I remember thinking, if this is all that's out there, I was really upset because I felt like there was this overwhelming number of choices and I didn't know which way to go. And as I tell that story, it often resonates with people who have been in that situation, who are on the other side of the table. That said, when I've given presentations to massive audiences of investors, facing a group of people who are 50-something, who are very financially successful, they probably haven't looked for a job in 20, 25 years. So trying to hook them on the relevance of my personal story may not necessarily be the most relevant. Instead, for them, thinking about their experiences, I'll often kind of paint the picture for them of someone who resembles their child, their young coworker. I might use visuals of what current job search sites look like, because those people probably haven't been on one of those in 15 or 20 years. And I paint a very different story based on where they're coming from as my audience than I might for someone who is much more of a younger person who feels the pain. Then I think the important thing is to think about how you construct the story. So choosing stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and keeping them concise. Generally, I like to think about 2 minutes being around a good time for a story length. Less if you're in a networking situation. I try and keep it to 20, 30 seconds. A little bit more if you're answering a tell me about yourself in an interview. But to be honest, there's nothing I think that kind of scuttles a good interview quickly than asking someone, tell me about yourself, and getting a 12-minute autobiography as a response. No matter how interesting you are and no matter how interested the person is, that's often a long time for one story. So think about what are the highlights of the story, how do I pull those out, and how do I make it kind of the right beginning, middle, and end for this audience. And then the last thing is to be authentic and to add personal details. This is obviously easier said than done, but I think the more comfortable you get and the more you think about your stories as a way to connect you with the other person, the more naturally this comes. So for example, I had to give a speech not that long ago about negotiation, particularly negotiating salaries, which is no one's idea of a good time. And I could have led with statistics about how hard negotiation is or the outcomes of negotiation. But instead, I started by telling people that the very first time I had to negotiate a raise, I was so uncomfortable that I went in the bathroom and threw up afterwards. And you could hear people, sit back, but it created this empathy between people who had experienced the discomfort and the fear of negotiating for a raise and me. And also, I think, connected us around something that they were definitely going to remember. So people sat up, they leaned forward, and they listened in for the rest of the talk. So now that we've talked a little bit about kind of some of the basics of storytelling, I want to go into one story 4 ways. So go to the next slide. This is kind of an interesting example of how you put this into practice. So what I'm going to do is basically tell you, roughly speaking, the same story, which is my career change story, as I would have told it in the very kind of pre-Muse days, but in 4 different contexts. And the first one is the elevator pitch. So the elevator pitch, as most of you know, it's kind of a 30-second in your back pocket description of who you are and what you do and what you're looking for that you can sort of take out of the bag, particularly at networking events. So, 2.5, 3 years ago, if I had gone to a networking event and someone said, oh, what do you do? What are you here for? I would have kept it short and sweet, and I might have said something to the effect of, well, I'm looking at a couple of different things in technology right now. I used to be a management consultant at McKinsey, and I spent a few months in Rwanda and Malawi working with the Clinton Foundation, and had a number of really interesting experiences, but realized that I'm just absolutely fascinated by what's going on in the technology space right now. So I'm looking to talk to people who are investors and part of high-growth technology startups, and that's why I'm here. It kind of gives people a quick sense of your background and a few things to hold on to. I'm also a big fan of just dropping 1 or 2 ways that people can help you into an elevator pitch, because particularly if you're at a networking event, people do really like to be helpful, I think. And so by telling them, oh, I'm looking to meet investors, or I'm looking to meet people who are active in the digital marketing space, it gives them a chance, if they do know anyone, to make a connection, which I think is great. So if I were then going to tell the exact same story about myself, but tailor it for a job interview, sort of a tell me about yourself, I'll go to the next slide. Here's how I think about doing that. Instead of focusing so much on me and what I want, in a job interview, I'd want to focus the same story on the employer and what they're really looking to know. So if someone said, tell me about yourself, I might say, well, I've always been interested in solving really big problems. I was initially drawn to management consulting because when I was younger and obviously learning a lot about how the business world worked, it seemed like one of the best places to get an education in how you go into these massive companies and target specific issues. And I was really excited to get a chance to learn from other people. But while I loved working in management consulting and I was at McKinsey, I knew that it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do for the long term, and that I wanted to do something with a bit more ownership. So I ended up taking a bit of time off. I worked in Rwanda and Malawi for several months, and then came back here to look at technology jobs. And so I think what I'm really excited about now is taking a chance to apply some of the business skills and some of the problem-solving skills that I was able to work on in my previous jobs, but also kind of take them to the next level at this opportunity. And again, turning the focus back on what it is that you can give to the company. The third example is a presentation. This one will be relatively short because I think as a presentation, you want to put your best foot forward. You want to very concisely sum up who you are and why you're doing there so that people can get just enough to know about you to really dig into the meat. Ultimately, generally they're there for the presentation, not for you. So that's why I'd say to keep it straight and simple. I don't want to bore you guys by giving my bio again, but I basically, if I were presenting, would stand up. Again, we'll talk about body language in a minute, but presentation is particularly important to kind of open your shoulders and look people in the eye and say, hello, I'm really excited to be here, everybody. My name's Kathryn Minshew, and before we get into my presentation, I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. I'm a recovering management consultant from McKinsey. I spent time in Rwanda and Malawi doing vaccine introduction, and along the way worked on a number of really interesting innovations in the kind of technology and healthcare space, which is what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. And then you can launch into your presentation. And then the final example is the ad hoc. I think, oops, I went too far. There we go, is ad hoc. And I think this is the hardest for some people because it's really challenging, to be honest, to figure out how to talk about yourself in a way that is very casual, that doesn't come off as rehearsed, but yet puts enough of yourself out there in a casual conversation to get the other person intrigued. This is where I find sometimes a little bit of self-deprecating humor can be helpful. So you might have noticed earlier, but I will sometimes say that I'm a refugee from management consulting, that I'm an escapee, that I'm a recovering management consultant. I say it with a smile because it's not to say anything negative about that part of my life, but also just to let people sympathize that there's something that I used to do that I don't do anymore, and we're all probably happy about that. Also, in an ad hoc example, I might say, oh, I'm a recovering management consultant, spent a couple months in Africa detoxing from corporate life, and got to work on some really interesting vaccine introductions, and now back here in New York, really excited about the technology space and exploring some of the options. And again, I think kind of leaving it as somewhat open-ended lets the person then ask the next question. Oh, what are you looking for? Oh, that sounds like such an interesting opportunity. And the more you can give the person that you're speaking to or presenting to kind of a way to think about what are their next questions, the more engaged they're going to be in your talk. So now that we've gone through, I think, some of the basics, the very last thing that I really want to talk about is nonverbal cues. And that's the slide that I accidentally clicked to, but we'll go to it now. So there's a couple really critical nonverbal cues in storytelling, the first of which is pretty basic, but it's stand up straight. No matter how many times people say this, you'll be amazed to see that a lot of people still give presentations looking like they're physically trying to take up as little space as possible. And you can see the difference if you go back a few slides to when, for example, if you look at someone and they're bending down, they're not taking up a lot of space, you can almost immediately see that people necessarily are going to start discounting a bit of what they're saying. They're not going to take them with the same level of credibility and authority. Similarly, I think using your hands effectively can be a way to demonstrate that you are here and you've arrived and you have something interesting and relevant to say. So for example, if you'll notice in this example, it almost looks like she's holding a ball. So if you switch back to the camera for just a second, I do a lot of talking with my hands roughly in this space. It's become natural over time, but it is something that I remember actually working on a little bit when I was younger, because when you use your hands, I think, again, it communicates that you're engaged, that you're passionate, but you also want to be careful about how. I had a teacher a long time ago who used to tease us about Tyrannosaurus Rex hands, which is essentially the phenomenon where people stick their elbows at their sides and wave their arms around just like this, but don't actually, move their hands more than this space. I think when you're speaking, it can be incredibly powerful to think about a couple of hand movements to both bring your hands close in and sometimes bring them out to make a point. And using those to really emphasize certain important things you're saying can help, again, people really buy into what you're saying and kind of dig in and engage more. The third is moving with purpose. So the way that I like to think about this is as an audience member, I'm sure you've seen a number of different people give professional speeches. When you think back to what really works and what doesn't, one of the big differences, I think, is how someone moves across the stage. There are some people who really move with purpose. They stand planted like a tree in a specific spot. They address the audience. They focus all of their energy on where they are. And maybe if the topic is changing or if they're coming up on a new area that they want to emphasize, they'll stop, move across the stage, plant themselves in a new spot, and continue speaking. And this is really important because the flip side is definitely not a lot of fun to watch. For example, I have a very dear friend who is a phenomenal public speaker, but recently gave a rather important presentation. He was extremely nervous. He had poured over his lines, rehearsed every bit. He knew it cold. And he went out and got up on the stage, and it was a bit small, and proceeded to literally pace back and forth the entire stage for a 20-minute presentation. And as someone sitting in the front row, it almost gave you whiplash because you're looking and you're looking and you're looking. And, you know, everybody, I think, was thinking, like, this guy is fascinating, but I would be able to concentrate so much more if he would just stand still. And that brings me to my final point, which is the dramatic pause, illustrated in this case by an all-white. What I think is so effective about the dramatic pause is it absolutely reaches out into an audience and grabs their attention. It's something that can be overused and is often mocked and joked about, but used sparingly, it's very, very effective. And what I mean by that is the audience gets used to the rhythm that you've created as a speaker. So as you're speaking, as you're drawing them into your point, if all of a sudden you stop, people sit forward. They want to know what's coming next. So thinking as you plan out a talk and as a speech, use of strategic dramatic pauses to really get people to focus and kind of listen in on what you're talking about can be extremely helpful. And then I think my final kind of tips are very much on the sort of personality of it. So smile even if you do not feel good. It makes you feel better. It puts people at ease. So think, you know, I like to sometimes blast really exciting music. I have a couple of songs. One of them's from the World Cup of 2010 in South Africa, but music that is just makes me feel good. It makes me feel ready to go, and anything that kind of lets you walk on stage with a smile. And as much as possible, as much as you're comfortable, I find making eye contact with people in the audience is incredibly effective because, again, it humanizes you and it draws you closer together. And ultimately, if you do it right, the audience is actually rooting for you to succeed. They're listening to you, they're engaging with you, and they're cheering for you, which I think is a fantastic situation. So I'll kind of wrap it there for a little bit. Would love to hear your questions about storytelling, about public speaking, about ridiculous mistakes I've made pitching the Muse, whatever is helpful. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. We had a very engaged audience, and since we were just recently talking about the dramatic pause, someone was asking when you were struggling during a presentation to come up with your next thought, etc. What are your tips for recovering? And what are especially in this particular person was asking about in a professional setting. What's the best way to hide the fact that you were just stumbling?
Yeah, so that's a very good question because everyone from the best presenters down to novices has that moment where in your head you're like, oh my goodness, I literally have no idea what I'm going to say next. And I think there's a few ways you can tackle that. One, so obviously before you get into a presentation, I think it can be really helpful to write down a couple of notes or things to remember. I have a couple of basic little note cards. They don't say a whole bunch and I'm not reading off of them, but it's partially a comfort that if I get to a point where I know there was something else I wanted to say and I can't remember it, I have something small that I can refer to. I also actually like PowerPoint for this respect. I don't put too much on the slides when I present, but one of the nice things about having them is that when you're talking and all of a sudden you forget what you're going to say next, you just click to the next slide, and often that will help you kind of go off to the races. I also personally have noticed that I use filler words sometimes when I don't know what I'm going to say next. So if I'm telling a story, and again, the helpful thing is usually you remember stories all the way through. So it's like once you get on the story, you can tell it until the end, because it's much harder for you to forget a story that you're telling. And when you get to the end of the story, if you're thinking and you're not sure what you wanted to say next, sometimes I will do kind of a nice dramatic pause, just like I'm, planning it all along to let it sink in, and then try to remember what is the closest thing that I can remember to the next point and move on. I often find that sometimes if you do skip a piece, you can kind of go back and get it later, and it's often, I find the trade-off to be worth it, and not seeming like you forgot something, even when actually, you may have forgotten a piece, skipped over it, and then attempted to go back to it at the very end. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but those are some of the things I think about.
And if anyone has a follow-up question, go ahead and write it there in chat. We're going to keep sort of breezing through these, so keep writing questions as soon as they come to you. On a similar vein, and I just did it myself, do you have some advice for people who really struggle with fillers like or things of that nature? How do you overcome those sort of crutches?
Yeah. So filler words are very, very tough because they creep into your language without you even realizing it, and they get stronger when you're nervous, which is when you're public speaking for many of us, for most of us. And I just did it there. Firstly, I find that being aware of what you're doing is a really, really helpful step. So recording yourself giving a talk and then forcing yourself to watch it is unbelievably effective. It's also unbelievably painful. So you have to be ready for the fact that no one likes how they look on camera, no one loves how they sound on camera. You're never going to be as presentable as you want, but just being aware of where you say certain filler words or do certain repetitive motions. Like some people, do the ear thing over and over again, and they may not notice it when they're speaking, but if you watch yourself, you certainly can. I've also had friends take it to more extreme measures. So I had one very close friend who said like a lot, and she actually had someone sit and watch her speak with a pile of very soft balls and throw them at her every time she said like. And it was actually, again, it was pretty funny. They dissolved into laughter, but it was a bit effective because every single time, whether she realized or not that she said like, she got hit by a plastic ball, and it made her much more on point.
Now I'm terrified of saying one of those fillers.
They happen to everybody. I think that eliminating them completely, if you can do it, more power to you. It's amazing. They are, to some extent, a classic part of being nervous, and every time you speak, you get a little bit closer towards being more comfortable, and it becomes easier to eliminate those things. So I also feel that giving yourself more opportunity, even if it's scary every time, and even if you completely bomb, I look at those as, well, I hopefully will never make those specific mistakes again.
Right.
And filler words, I think, are one of those things that it becomes easier to edit out as you become more comfortable with yourself and with the story that you're telling on stage.
Right. So it becomes just, you start developing new fillers and new bad habits to get rid of. Some people, also very relevant to what we're doing right now, a couple of our users, Tucker and a few others, are asking about impromptu questions, and inevitably at the end of every presentation like this one, you're going to get asked questions that you weren't possibly prepared for.
Mm-hmm.
How do you cope with that element of public speaking? The unexpected, specifically questions.
So I actually love the question part, although they definitely can be a little bit unnerving. There's a few different strategies based on the situation and the question. One is the misdirection strategy, which I also call the television strategy. So I first started getting to go on TV and talking about the Muse about a year or a year and a half ago, and I was so nervous. And I sat down with a good friend of mine who had a lot of experience in that, and one of the first things he said was, you don't actually have to answer the question they ask as long as you seem like you do, and as you seem very agreeable doing it. So this is a bit easier said than done, and it certainly works with certain types of questions more than others. But, I remember once being on, I think, Bloomberg, and someone asking me, well, specifically, can you quantify for us how many companies have been added to the Muse in the last month? And I was like, absolutely. We are substantially increasing the number of companies. We're growing in every major city across the board. And I basically went on to answer, but not entirely answer, because it was data that I didn't have at my fingertips, and I didn't want to make it up or lie on air. Similarly, when people ask questions, generally I try and answer them. But if it's something completely either out of the blue, something that makes me really uncomfortable to discuss, one of the strategies is answering with enthusiasm and simply guiding the discussion away from the specific question that you're asking. Depending again on what exactly you're talking about, it can be a really helpful way to answer part of what they're asking or answer something that's related but that doesn't, say, put you in a really uncomfortable position. If it's something that you should know the answer to but just don't, I find being honest, people ultimately, on one hand, they do want to see you as an expert because you're up there speaking. On the other hand, they're people and they know that you're a person too. And so I think it actually goes over better than you'd imagine when someone asks, do you know XYZ? Do you have data on this? Saying, it's actually a really good question. I don't have the data on that right now, but actually, if you find me after the talk, I'll love to give you my email address and we can talk about it later. There's also, sometimes I find preparing ahead of time for what are the questions you're most likely to get asked can make me feel more comfortable that I've probably got my bases covered. And again, it's generally if it's something that I know the answer to, I'll answer it. If it's something that I really feel uncomfortable talking about or don't think should be addressed, then sometimes I'll say, oh, that's a really interesting question. Our funding history has been, we've raised in XYZ rounds, but only give the information I want to and just kind of ignore the parts of the question that I don't think are relevant to answer on stage, for example. And if it's something that I really should know or want to know but don't, then sometimes I'll just tell people straight out, that's a great question. I'll have the answer by tomorrow. And if you want to meet me afterwards, would love to talk more about it.
That's a very sneaky move. Another one of our users has a question. We covered so many different elements of public speaking, and Kanan wants to know if you have any tips on pacing, specifically whether you need to vary it. You talked a lot about pausing already, but for some people who speed up, what's a good way of catching yourself, I guess, and finding that natural pace?
So I definitely speed up. You all may have noticed that there were times during this presentation when I was speaking so quickly that I cut the ends off my words. And that's something that I think a lot of people deal with. For me, right now, for example, I'm concentrating a bit more than usual on finishing my words, on putting space between them. And so just being aware of your pacing is a huge step towards slowing it down. Back to my point about video recording yourself, one of the best ways to find out that you speak very quickly is to speak into a camera, to practice your presentation, and then watch yourself afterwards. It can also help to speak to someone else and ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, with 5 being perfect, how would you rate my pace? And hearing them say, well, I think it's probably an 8, a 9 on the fast end of the spectrum can be a helpful way to think about it. I find for me that pacing and emphasis go very well together. So if I were just to say everything around the same tempo and cadence and keep going, then the pace would not necessarily vary very much, and it also wouldn't be very interesting for you. But on the other hand, when you think about carving up your sentences into small, discrete pieces of information that you want the audience to understand, you may not even be telling a story, but you're using some of the the way people approach words when they're excited about getting you to understand a story with varying tempo, pace, intonation on those words. I think some of it comes just more naturally. And so sometimes I find, practicing telling a really great long joke or a story that is going to be interesting and thinking to yourself, if I were telling the story to a wider audience, how fast am I speaking? What is my mouth doing? How are the words coming out? How am I emphasizing things? It just makes you, for me at least, it makes me much more aware, and then I can port that back over into how I feel and how I hear myself when I'm public speaking.
That was very helpful. A couple of people are also asking, related to all of this, how to best prepare for public speaking events. Do you have any advice? Some people are saying that in their job they don't have an opportunity to speak publicly. A couple of people here have done Toastmasters. So there's a lot of questions around practice and opportunities, I guess, to overcome this fear.
Yeah, so that's a great question, because honestly, practice does make a massive difference in how comfortable you feel. And I think there's a few different ways you can go about it. Formally, people mention Toastmasters or other clubs that really encourage people to do public speaking. They're also helpful because you'll have a really supportive community of people who are listening to you speak and encouraging you. And some of those people, even the ones who seem like fantastic speakers, probably started out very nervous and in many cases very uncomfortable themselves. So they can give you the motivation that public speaking is a skill like any other skill, and it's not something that you're either born with or you're not. Improv classes can be another fun way to do this. I know a lot of major cities have classes. Upright Citizens Brigade is one in New York here, but there's tons, I think Second City in Chicago, all around the country. And you learn some of the same skills. It's very intimidating because you might be put in a room and say, okay, tell a story about an onion and an alien and it's set in Milwaukee, go. But there's no penalty for failure. It's probably going to be really hilarious. And it just, again, gives you that practice. For people who are interested more professionally, I think there's a few things. One is asking colleagues if they're interested in practicing public speaking together, because you know enough of the business norms and the culture of of the business you're in to be able to give each other really tactical feedback. I also think sometimes going out and trying to find speaking opportunities for yourself. So for example, there are a lot of small events going on every night here in New York and in many other cities as well that are looking for people to be on a panel or to give a short talk. I personally find panels far less intimidating than a full talk because generally you're just chatting about things with other people on the panel. The moderator asks you questions. You don't have to memorize and remember a story arc of a massive speech. And organizers of these events are often very open to people suggesting themselves. So I often encourage people at the Muse who are interested in doing more public speaking to find events, email organizers and say, I love this event on digital marketing. I do XYZ in digital marketing and I'm really excited about sharing that. If you're ever looking for an upcoming speaker, let me know. And it's nice as well because you're not asking them, please make me a speaker, which puts them in the awkward position of saying yes or no. You're simply saying, I love what you do. I think you bring great groups together. And if you're ever looking for someone like me, I'd be happy to say yes, which means that they can respond nicely regardless. And if they're interested, they may reach out to you. And if they're not, no harm, no foul. So those kind of a couple of my ideas. I'll probably think of more later. But just how I've kind of thought about getting different opportunities to practice. I also sometimes will say yes to public speaking things, even though I'm really honestly afraid to do them, because if the professional consequences won't be terrible of me not being as good as I'd like to be, I just chalk it up to practice. I'm like, well, could have been better at that, could have been better prepared, but that is how you learn. And judging the riskiness and then, saying yes if it's not too risky, I think is, it's a great strategy.
Thank you. That was incredibly helpful, and I'm really glad that you mentioned improv because I actually recently signed up for a class to help me with my confidence since I was going to be on camera, and a couple of people here are asking about resources like books or other online classes, and I completely agree with you in terms of practicing and getting out there.
Mm-hmm.
That's really sound advice.
Yeah, and
definitely the best way to overcome any obstacles you're facing in this area.
And I was to say, and not to plug the Muse, but I have to just once because I'm here. We have a lot on public speaking as well. I know GA does some really nice work on it, but at either General Assembly or themuse.com, there's kind of tips and advice from people who have grappled with some of the big issues around public speaking and different types. How is presenting for an office different from speaking to an auditorium, different from going on, God forbid, television or something like that?
And thank you. Everyone should definitely check out the Muse afterwards. We have a couple more things to touch on. A couple of people have asked about engagement with the audience, and one person's question was around if you've noticed that people have tuned out, how do you re-engage them? But then additionally, a couple of people have asked about asking questions to the audience and sort of breaking down the fourth wall. So what kind of advice do you have around that type of dynamic?
Yeah, that's a great question around engaging with the audience. So I guess a few different things that I've done that have worked or not worked for me. One is starting off with a story. So one of the most successful pitches that I ever gave for the Muse started off with the phrase, last year, 20% of Americans said they'd rather die than go to the dentist, and they'd rather go to the dentist than look for a new job. That phrase got people leaning forwards in their seats. First of all, starting it with last year indicates that a story is coming, or that some sort of kind of time-sensitive chronological event is coming, which I think perks people's kind of subconscious, and then giving a statistic that relates to something everyone in the audience has experienced, which is going to the dentist, really sort of brought them in. So I definitely love, I think engaging the audience is really important, especially off the bat. That's why no matter how nervous or terrified or unprepared I feel, when I walk onto the stage, I have the biggest smile and I'm like, hey everyone, I'm so excited to be here, because they also feed off your energy. And so if I were to go up on stage and say, hi, I'm really excited to be here, I'm Kathryn, then the audience would just go like, whoomph. As to asking questions, so what's interesting is, I think asking questions is really effective if you have good questions. It's not something that works as well for me, because for whatever reason, whenever I think of questions to ask the audience in a speech, I feel like they're often dumb questions. And I respect my audience, I want to think they're smart. And I don't like when people ask me, raise your hand if you've ever been afraid of public speaking. Like, okay, me and everyone else. That said, I have been in the audience when people have asked really smart questions, either questions designed to make you realize that you think you're alone in something, but actually a lot of people feel it too. That can be really effective. I also like intent questions. So, for example, how many of you own a business? How many of you are thinking of starting a company? How many of you, how many of you work in digital marketing? Whatever the space is, understanding your audience ahead of time can be helpful. But I do think it's any questions I would say are worse than nothing. Good questions are an incredibly effective technique. And then finally, to the suggestion about if you've lost your audience, it's a really scary moment. I have definitely had it. The moment when you're speaking and you realize, oh my goodness, people are massively checked out. I think there's two things to keep in mind. One is that sometimes only 5% of people are massively checked out and the other 95% are really with you, but because there's that really checked out guy in the front row, you feel like everyone's checked out. So my first instinct when I am speaking and I notice that someone's checked out is to basically try and assume that if that's the person I've noticed at checkout, I'm probably just noticing them, and many other people in the audience are engaged. And then obviously I try and do a temperature check by, as I'm making eye contact and looking in the room, seeing whether anyone else is. If they are, I've often been known to actually massively kind of stop what I was planning on saying or kind of finish the point I'm on, but then jump ahead a bit if I think I can skip things that are non-essential to get to something that's really interesting, or just tell people why they're there. I remember once giving a long talk and I realized in the middle people were checking out, but I also realized I probably hadn't done a very good job of telling them why it was important they pay attention to begin with. So as I kind of finished one of the points, I said, all right, I'm gonna stop this for a moment and I wanna go back to why are we here? Why do I think this is really important? And then I just spoke, for probably 20 seconds about what is the entire reason that we are all here, why is it interesting or important that you listen to me, and people actually, to me, seemed to really engage with that. They reminded them of our kind of shared goal, and then when I dove back into the details of what I was talking about, it brought people on board, and that, I think, is more helpful for a work presentation. Also, sorry, one more thing, and that's if I'm speaking with a smaller group, let's say it's a business presentation, and people start, having a big conversation or are just kind of not paying attention, then I'll just stop talking. And it makes people really uncomfortable, and they stop talking, and then you continue talking. And, you can be really nice about it. You're not being mean. You're just like, it's fine. I'll just wait. And generally, people get it. They kind of finish their conversations, and then you can go back. And I find, sometimes you obviously have to talk over a bit of side conversation, but if it gets really distracting and you're in a professional setting, I think it's completely appropriate to just say, no, it's fine. I want to make sure everyone hears, so I'll wait until the conversations are done.
As you could see, I was very uncomfortable by silence and felt the need to fill that silence.
It makes people incredibly uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable too, but sometimes pushing through it a little bit is helpful.
Make sure that everyone's actually paying attention to what's happening.
Yeah, because people are like, why is no one talking?
That's the best way. Speaking of hecklers, someone has a question about humor. Sometimes we've all been there, I'm sure, been to a couple of talks where someone is trying very hard to use this presentation as an opportunity to try out stand-up. What's your advice on, using the appropriate amount of humor, and also, I guess, gauging how it's landing with your audience?
Yeah. So I think a big piece of public speaking is knowing your strengths. I don't use a lot of jokes when I talk because, frankly, I'm not that funny. I'm really funny at telling, funny jokes in my office to other people, but I think as an individual, there are people who can go up on stage and absolutely light an audience on fire. And if you can do that, I think it's fantastic, and you should play that up because it is a gift. Other people, I find that for me, vulnerability is a big part of my public speaking. I'm very comfortable telling stories that don't always make me look amazing, like throwing up after trying to negotiate a raise. I mean, that's embarrassing, but it's also something that a lot of people relate to. And so for me, my public speaking style tends to be much more focused on the kind of just very genuine stories, this like shared human emotion of just being on this crazy planet and all of the things that happen because of that. And I personally don't do a lot of jokes. I love when people laugh. If I say something funny, it makes me feel like fist pumping, but it's not, I think again, it's if you've got the right joke for the situation, it's also a good thing to try out on other people, because there's nothing that's harder to your self-confidence as a public speaker than trying a joke and just hearing it go nowhere. That doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't still completely rooting for you. They just might not think that joke is funny, but be completely on board with the rest of your talk. So I think it can be really effective if done well, but it's not my strong suit, and so I tend to try and like play with the things that work for me and let other people do the funny jokes.
All right. That's good. It's good advice. I think it's hard to self-assess and decide whether or not
it's very hard. Although asking other people can be helpful. After I used to give business presentations when I was a consultant, my manager would, I would sit down outside and be like, okay, what could I have done to make that better? And it's pretty intense getting feedback on a regular basis like that. I even once had a manager who recorded me giving a presentation to probably 8 to 10 very senior clients, and then came back and we listened to it, and he said, did you hear how when you proposed that idea, your voice went up as if you weren't sure? If you had carried and been more authoritative, they would have been more interested in the recommendation. And pointing out things like that was incredibly valuable, although it's not easy to do. So I think the more that you can practice with somebody, whether they're a friend, a supervisor, et cetera, who can give you that sort of feedback, it really is helpful, even though it's not fun.
On that note, there's a couple of people who have questions about gender and the appearance, and so similarly, I mean, do you have any guidance specifically for women, not to alienate the rest of the audience? We'll have one more question after this one that's totally gender neutral. Do you have any advice for women in terms of dressing and the way that you're presenting yourself? Because that's a part of the presentation that we didn't cover so much on in terms of your appearance beyond your stature.
Yeah. So I think that's actually, I'll talk about for specifically women, but I think some of it's very relevant to both genders. First of all, you really want to be comfortable. I cannot tell you the special hell that is, trying to give a presentation with like pants that are really tight or shoes that don't quite fit right or something that pulls on your arm. Anything that's going to take you away from focusing on the conversation is just not something you want to deal with when you're giving a talk. So definitely I would say it's not a time for new shoes, etc. In terms of specifically what I found, I like to assess my audience. Again, this goes back to the question of who are you speaking to and why are they here? And then think a little bit about where is the sort of Venn diagram place where who I am and what they want out of this meet, and are there choices that I make in terms of how I dress that play into that? So for example, with business conferences, I always wear a very bright single color sheath dress. And one of the reasons is it looks very professional, but it's feminine, and people can find me afterwards. I think one of the great things about giving a talk at a conference is that for the rest of the day, especially if you go early in the day, people will find you and say, oh, I heard you talk, or I heard your comment, and the more that you stand out, the easier it is for people to find you. So I try generally not to wear black in those sorts of contexts. On the flip side, when I give talks to primarily startup and technology audiences, I often wear a black leather jacket and black leather pants, or I guess black pants and black leather boots and a black t-shirt. And, why is that? It's because I think there are two sides to a lot of the conversations that I give. I have sometimes where I'm talking about hiring and the Muse, and it's very professional. And there's other times I'm talking about startups and, not running out of money in the early days where you're eating ramen. And not only is it very comfortable for me to be wearing, this like black leather jacket, but I also think it tends to kind of communicate a lot of the same. It kind of supports the message I'm communicating, which is, I'm going to tell you the story about crazy stuff that happened, and it was really tough to get through, but guess what, we did it. And by the way, I'm wearing black leather. So I think there's a little bit of a space that you can play around with, women or men, but obviously for women, there's often a lot more choices and then judgments. And then finally, if you are going to be sitting while giving a talk, definitely I always go with longer dresses because I get, sometimes people put you on stools and you're like, how do I cross my legs on this? And the more that you're thinking about not flashing the audience or being uncomfortable or something pinching, the less you're thinking about just giving a totally awesome speech and telling a story. So, sometimes it's trial and error. Everyone's worn something to give a talk that they really wish that they didn't. But I like to go with, like at least one thing in a really bright color, or something that is kind of in the vein, like it's a variation on the vein of what other people are going to be wearing, but with a twist to it.
Thank you, Kathryn. I'm just going to give everyone a moment to think about if they have any other questions. We're coming up on the end of our time here, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time and schedule. So I think the last question that we're going to end with, that a couple of people have asked, so I think it's just fine. Some people had a few more questions about the concept of storytelling, and so as concisely as possible, could you give advice on what types of stories you think resonate specifically in a business setting? What about them, I guess, you think really hits well during presentations?
Yeah, so I think storytelling can serve two main purposes. One is to say, I'm just like you, and establish that relationship between the teller and the listener. And another is to kind of illuminate the humanity of someone who is different. So for example, that would be a story about a customer. You can say that 26% of people who buy this product are on food stamps, but it's much more impactful to say that 26% of people who buy this product are on food stamps. And for example, there's Jennifer, who is a single mother who's living in so-and-so. This is why she buys it. This is what she loves it. Kind of humanizing the statistic. People will remember what you tell them if it's told in a story much more than if you just give them facts and statistics. So when I think about what stories are appropriate, obviously try and keep it to stories that are professional. So generally no stories that involve sex or alcohol or politics, things like that. But stories that are I think that bring people kind of into closer understanding with each other. So whether it's about some of the struggles that people go through, obviously big and small, a variety of different situations, but everyone has certain things that are challenging, and talking about a story of either one of your customers or yourself and how you overcame a challenge or how that fits in with the business perspective being discussed. I think those are some of the most powerful.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. That was a great answer. By the way, if anyone has any other questions, let's keep the conversation going online. Your Twitter handle, I believe, is on the last slide for anyone who didn't get to see it. Came in at the Daily Muse, which is, of course, the Muse's handle. And check out a lot more of Kathryn's talks and content and everything at themuse.com. There are some really excellent articles in there about public speaking that I have also referenced many times myself. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. We really appreciate your support. Have a nice night.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks.